I think it's been a really great experience to participate in this speaker series, especially during a difficult time in the world. It helps us really stay engaged in discussions of conservation and experience different programs across the globe. Also, a really timely day for engaging community perspectives in the US. It's Thanksgiving. Recently, the recent edition of Indigenous Peoples Day to recognize the Indigenous perspectives of communities in the US. And so I think it's sort of just a perfect storm for discussion today. Two other warnings. I'm a recovering academic, so I have outlined a little bit of a script to keep myself on task. Otherwise, I can go on a tangent quite quickly. And at one point, there will be some audience participation required using the chat function. Nobody will be unmuted, but I would ask for responses in a chat. And as a professor, I am very capable of sitting here in long, awkward silences waiting for your replies. And one final thank you. I will say that a lot of the images I'm using today from Sangha Sangha come from the guests of Sangha Lodge, who over the years have been very supportive in allowing me to use some of the beautiful imagery that they've taken during their times there. All right, let me outline what I'm going to talk to you about today. Firstly, I'm going to provide a little bit of my own background, quite simply telling you who I am and what's brought me here. I know there are several students in the audience, and I think oftentimes that's a fruitful discussion for them to see that the path isn't always straight. And as one of my talks today is to convince you why we must reimagine programming and conservation practice. Next, we'll turn to a discussion of the primary problems that we're addressing in conservation practice. This will not be a shock to you, having been to all these talks and most of you being part of the conservation world yourselves. And finally, I'll talk about changing perspectives, starting with our own. My training is rooted in primate behavioral ecology and primate field methods. My earliest work was in the Americas, studying the effects of habitat fragmentation on New World primates. And I will admit that at this point in my life as a student, I really was not paying much attention to what was happening with human communities and conservation landscapes. It was around the same time that I wasn't paying attention that I realized I had to start paying attention. When studying human-induced habitat change, I noticed that the lives of people living in the context of protected areas were dramatically affected by the presence of conservation economies. I moved on at that point to the Central African Republic, where I started looking at what I call shared ecologies. Other researchers will call them mutual ecologies. This is essentially looking at the interrelated connections between humans and other species and the way they shape one another mutually. In this case, I was examining hunting technology, the bushmeat trade, and wildlife dynamics. For example, during this work, I found that there's a complex system of co-adaptation between hunters, depending on technology, and avoidance and anti-predator strategies on the part of primarily Cercopithecine primates, arboreal monkeys, that is, and small forest ungulates. At this time, I found that wildlife populations in this area were certainly declining and became very interested in how conservation and wildlife declines affected the health of human communities, particularly forest foragers in Central Africa. I was lucky enough at this point to work with my colleague and then PhD advisor, Dr. Melissa Remus, to look at how health and ecological integrity are interrelated in the Congo Basin. And this is an area of work that's ongoing for this particular research group, actually being carried on right now by Elizabeth Hall, who introduced herself earlier, a doctoral student at Purdue. And more recently, and sort of possibly more of a backdrop for the discussions today, I won't go into the theory of ethnoprimatology and multi-species ethnography because it's quite dense and boring unless you're really into it. But they're really important frameworks for understanding the ways that human and wildlife relationships cannot be disentangled. Multi-species ethnography is a field that emphasizes the relational history of humans, non-humans, and even the objects that make up their environment, and really challenges us to think about the ways that humans engage the world around them in a different way. So that's a lot of diverse areas of study that I've ended up at some point in my life. I always show this to students to remind them that the path is not always straightforward. And more importantly, to keep in mind that our responsibilities as researchers often extend far beyond the disciplines of our training. In addition to my own research and work, I've found that I'm required to be an educator, a mediator, a communicator, an activist, and even a storyteller. This messy diagram reminds me to always be aware of my positionality of a researcher and how that shapes the way I see conservation. Again, just using my own example, you can fill in your own little emoji and paint your own path. Lucky for me, I found a home for this mess that shaped my career at Chingetta Wildlife. A holistic approach to conservation is the bread and butter of anthropology, and it is the bread and butter of Chingetta Wildlife. Working to understand legal and illegal wildlife economies demands interdisciplinary approaches that cannot be approached from a single form of knowledge. And it's really about encapsulating those different forms of knowledge that I'm going to talk about today. I'll talk briefly about Chingetta Wildlife now, and then circle back to it at the end of the talk. At Chingetta Wildlife, right now, I'm the Director of Sociocultural Research and Community Engagement. We focus on delivering lasting anti-poaching solutions across a multitude of landscapes. Some of you have heard the previous talk of Rory Young, our president and founder, and so you might remember that. The summary of the work that we do. We focus very closely on working with in-country partners to find solutions to illegal wildlife trades that are holistic, yet site-specific and expensive, integrative, and most importantly, ethical. And as I said, I'll expand a bit more on this later in the talk, particularly our work with communities. So before moving on to the main body of the talk, it's really important for me personally to acknowledge why I'm able to do the work that I can do. And I always try to do that at the front of the talk rather than the back of the talk, because it can quite often become lost as we undoubtedly go over time and want to run into the question and answer period. So my acknowledgements come now in the middle. The communities I have worked with for the last 12 years in the Central African Republic, in Southwest Cameroon, and across the Congo Basin are the foundations of who I am and what I'm able to do. And my own imaginings of wildlife that I'm going to talk to you about today are a kaleidoscope of the things that I have learned from working with these communities, of the ways that I was challenged to think differently about conservation and differently about forest use. I would also not be able to do the work I'm doing without long-term collaborations and publications with colleague Dr. Melissa Remus at Purdue University. As a doctoral student, I was part of her research group, and we have ongoing and continued work in the Central African Republic, particularly in the Zonga-Sanga protected areas, where I also work closely with doctoral student Liz Hall, also a member of the Chingetta team. And then also to point out, I have ongoing ethnoprimatological work and education work with Alexandra Hoffner at the University of Georgia that also continues to inform my perspectives on wildlife. Okay, thank you for indulging me in that. Let's return back to the outline and the problem that we're discussing today. Not a new problem. Across West and Central Africa, the trade in global resources and fluctuations in both political and economic stability and as well as agricultural expansion have varied impacts on biodiversity and human communities. The most typical pattern being declining biodiversity and increasing impacts on human communities. Keeping in mind that the impacts on human communities vary from positive to negative and occasionally, but rarely, having neutral outcomes. This will not surprise anyone on the call or in the room. It's not a new problem in the field of conservation. The problem is really that we're still addressing it, that we're still seeking solutions to the same issues. And it's no secret that anthropologists and recovering academics such as myself have spent many hours critiquing conservation practice. I myself have done it, but the issue is that we can't critique conservation practice without providing solutions or working collaboratively with organizations, partners on the ground, and all key stakeholders, particularly students and community members, on how to move forward and see conservation differently. Why are we still addressing the same issues? Conventional narratives of sustainability that undergird conservation are often imprecise and ambitious. Most approaches to conservation were originally limited in their inability to predict the future needs of human populations that were reliant on protected areas. And this is not a pointing of fingers, it's a simple statement of the fact that the original scope of most conservation projects and conservation science could not possibly account for all of the multiple ways that people's lives change and the ways that people experience conservation, and what this would have on the impacts this would have on the success of particular projects. Additionally, the one thing that always has fascinated me about conservation biology as a discipline, and something I used to speak quite a bit with students about, is how surprisingly static we are in our approaches to conservation. And the reason that I find this fascinating is because conservation biology itself emerged as a sort of what you might call a crisis discipline, or in response to immense environmental challenges that individuals were noticing in the 70s and 80s and even earlier. Right, so here you have a discipline that was dynamic and responsive and emerged quite quickly to face large global challenges, established itself and became a staple of the way that we approach environmental issues. Yet, in many ways, decades later, the practices of conservation themselves are still quite static. We're still trying to find a silver bullet to conservation problems, which is something that doesn't exist. We have yet to renegotiate the terms of how we conduct and participate in conservation. And the idea of reimagining wildlife is really a challenge to all of us who participate, follow, or understand conservation to reimagine the ways that we think about it. Of course, the science of species loss and the science that backs population dynamics and conservation is clear, but we also cannot ignore that the scope of conservation itself is rooted in Western philosophies that can create a framework that's narrow and biased towards certain types of knowledge, often privileging it over others. So that's a large problem, right? It's a grand scale problem that's often easier to look away from than to address, but how can we address it? Generally, when I'm working with contracting partners and students, they're always surprised to find that the solutions that I offer are quite simple in practice, but very complex in their execution. They require a reframing of everything we do and require us to see things differently, which is why they become complicated. It's hard to look at your own work and try to see ways to make it better. As an anthropologist, I will always argue that our attention must be on examining all aspects of forest systems. We have to understand the ebb and flow of life in a protected forest from a diversity of perspectives, which means we must collaborate with others. There's no way that I can do the work that I do on my own. I have to collaborate with other groups, other researchers, other nonprofit organizations, other governmental organizations to really get the work done. Before moving on, we have to sort of address the bullet points here of things we should do. Most importantly, I want to make a note about the term we, because I use it quite a bit and I've put it in quotes here, particularly as I'm talking about the importance of collaboration with communities, right? We is meant to be an inclusive term. That's what it is in the English language and in most languages. And I would really like it to be an inclusive term in conservation. But in reality, the we in conservation is often an exclusive group of people who generally think like me and oftentimes look like me. And this has to change. Right, we must include the diversity of voices of the individuals in the areas we're seeking to protect. And let me give you an example from my own work. I've done a lot of publishing over the years on hunting of non-human primates and other species. And in many cases, this requires documentation of the presence or absence of certain species, particularly critically protected species. Depending on the country or where you're at, this could be listed as Class A or different levels of protection status at the national and international level. In many cases, in my own work, I publish on ethnographic data or interviews with other individuals, and a lot of my work relied on participant observation with hunters, right, who are quite often possibly engaged in illegal activities, which is a very complex notion of how we get to what's illegal and what's not illegal, but we can come back to that. The point being that in publishing my own data, it's never been enough to say that a hunter observed a certain species of primate, right? I've had reviewers return manuscripts saying that a hunter observation is not an observation of an endangered species, leaving the species out to sort of not preclude the area where I'm talking about, right? The observation of the species was only valid if it came from myself or a member of my research team trained in methods. To me, that's quite problematic because I learned the forest and I learned how to find these species from the hunters themselves, right? So here as an example of where we was not inclusive of the voices that understood the situation. We must be dynamic. This is challenging as a lot of conservation relies on funding cycles, other forms of bureaucracy, but we can't let this be a limiting factor. In fact, we're not even to the point of reimagining conservation to where this really is truly the limiting factor. We must change the way we view data, as I've addressed briefly in thinking about what forms of data and knowledge are valuable, but also in the types of data that should be included in conservation practice. And finally, we must find a way to reimagine the systems that we seek to protect and the protections designed to support them. So how can we address this problem of declining biodiversity, increased impacts on humans, and the fact that we're still answering the same question or seeking a solution to the same problem? One option that surfaces a lot of workshops of conservation is that we need to modify behavior of human communities or provide alternatives. But how can we do this when we don't necessarily truly understand the system? We cannot change behavior, but we can change perspectives, and we must start with their own. This can be done through addressing history, assessing data, including what counts as data and who are community, and reimagining the wildlife and the forest system through a new lens. We're going to start with changing our perspectives, okay? And this is where I'm going to ask for a little bit of input. Several people on the call, most people will know what this is a picture of. I want you to take a look at this photo and quickly in the chat type for me what you see, what this brings to mind for you, what it is, anything really. Okay, forest elephants, waterhole, minefield, a bay with some elephants, safety, a vast wilderness, an area that is not forested. Excellent, great. A meeting place, animal tracks, water. Okay, excellent. Right, so everybody sees that it's a bay, it's a forest clearing, right? Those of us who are sitting as close to the computer as I am can see the tiny little elephants in the screen. Right, this is the Zonga Saling and the Zonga Protected Areas Complex, right? One of the crown jewels of the Zonga Trinational Forest Complex, right? Here's a close-up view if we zoomed in and changed our perspective a little bit to see the inclusion of some other wildlife. And it is indeed, right? It is indeed a forest clearing. It's a meeting place for elephants. But for me, right, I have to start thinking about what else it is. Right, I used to see the bay as a pretty picture, as a place where wildlife met, right, where elephants come. It's an elephant-created landscape where elephants come digging up trees, toppling trees, and opening up these spaces in search of minerals. And I've done a lot of work on understanding these systems and the trails that link them in the Congo Basin with Melissa Remus. I can point you to our most recent paper in American Anthropologist. But really, what I want us to think about are the other perspectives that undergird this image that aren't necessarily present, right? This is indeed, I think Rory said it's a meeting place. Hopefully he came up with that on his own, and maybe I have said it to him in the past. This is a point, right, where animals meet, where species meet, where groups of elephants come together to reunite after significant periods of time apart. It also, predating conservation, was a place where colonialists met the organisms which they sought for the ivory trade, right? People use the trail systems to access the Zonga Bay. It's prevalent on maps, colonial maps from the area as Bar and Doku, which means elephant camp. It's a meeting place for people, right? There used to be family camps for Bayakas foragers around these areas where people came and exchanged marriage partners, dances, ideas, materials, right? It's a space where legal meets illegal, where we have to redefine what is poaching, what is not poaching, who has access, who does not have access. It's also not just in the present time, right? Here you have a space where past and present shape the future, right? The past of the Zonga Saline really informs the way that conservation was set up in this region and also how it will take shape in the future. While it's a beautiful place, right, I would also remind us that in 2013, after the coup d'etat, it was also a place of trauma and fear for both elephants and people as rebels came in and massacred a large number of elephants in a single day. There are a lot of different ways to think about this saline beyond a clearing where elephants come for minerals, where other creatures come for salts. It's important to keep in mind these different perspectives on a famous clearing. But how do these perspectives and the forms of knowledge generated from understanding these different perspectives become knowledge? And how do we attend to the different ways of knowing this particular part of the forest? To change our perspective and to integrate diverse ways of knowing, we have to first consider our own knowledge at a personal level, rooted in our background and culture. An example I can give you of my own first coming to Zangasanga was that, unrelated to the Bai, but I was coming to study hunting. I had visions of a forest dripping with monkeys, right? I'd been working in a forest previously where I could walk around myself. If I ever got lost, if I kept walking long enough, I'd just walk out the other side of the forest into a farm and I'd head back home. When I got to the Central African Republic and I started looking for monkeys, it was 3 months before I saw a live animal. And it was at that point that I had to reassess the way that I viewed the forest through the lens of the individuals who were teaching me the forest. Once we consider our own personal level, we have to consider the scientific level of ways of knowing. As a scientist or emerging scientist, or a scientist adjacent, I think we're all scientists at heart, or natural historians at least, we're trained in theory and method and practice that are most relevant to our home discipline. At a very basic level, we're trained to use objective approaches like the scientific method. And this is how we realize our research and our results, right? Through theory, method, and practice and objectivity. Keeping in mind that scientific methods and scientific approaches come from a very specific lens of culture, often associated with Western approaches or the global North. For some of us, right, our personal views, our personal ways of knowing align quite nicely with scientific ways of knowing. And working in we often engage directly and indirectly with the beliefs and experiences of the communities who share spaces with wildlife, and at a higher level with the environment. We certainly try to address the ways that people value wildlife. And these valuations can take the form of economic, social, nutritional, cultural, and cosmological. But we do have to remain conscious that scientific level knowledge privileges certain ways of knowing, and that conservation in the past has built upon these very exclusive perceptions. In fact, if I had more time in preparing this talk, instead of making pies, I would have added a few more graphs, a few more gears to this graph to think about the different ways that people value wildlife at different levels across stakeholder groups. Now, we can think about these diverse perspectives and diverse ways of knowing, and then we have to consider the way that this becomes knowledge or data. So I spend a lot of time in my own work thinking about what counts as data. Ways of knowing about a forest ecosystem require us to really think about what counts in a report, what counts when a funder looks at a report, what counts when we're trying to argue for more support. And how does this vary across disciplines of research? These images here are very limited, but they show a few of the physical attributes that we might count as data in ecological work. So dung piles, in my own studies of hunting, looking for cartridge casings, footprints, right? There's the backside of a diker. You could include in this camera traps, GPS collaring data, habituation data from following gorillas in this region or other species of animals. And this generally is quantitative and counts in the scientific world as data, and in the conservation field as evidence of the presence or absence of wildlife. Now, in the same way that we work to understand ecologies of wildlife, we also have to understand human ecology and the shared ecologies of humans and wildlife. We have to think very critically about what counts as data when we're working on the human side of conservation. Of course, we can collect semi-structured interviews, survey data, hunter offtake data, things that are more traditionally quantitative. But what happens in a lot of research and publication processes, and as we sort of value what becomes knowledge in the scientific world, is that qualitative data are left out. It's very hard to explain how this picture in the bottom right corner can be data, right? So what we have in this picture is an image of a colleague becoming a gorilla through storytelling, right? When we think about human behavior, we have to understand the different ways that people value wildlife intrinsically, extrinsically, socially, and cosmologically, and how these transvaluations of wildlife play out in daily life. For example, An individual can value a gorilla in multiple different ways. Gorillas could be valued for intrinsically for their beauty, for their similarities to human counterparts, for the money that's brought in from ecotourism. And also, right in the Congo Basin, there's a lot of discussion of the roles of gorillas and other great ape species as tools or analogies or ways to moderate discussions of social inequality. So many times in storytelling, individuals will become another animal, that will become a gorilla. In other areas of the Congo Basin, human communities identify individuals as other animals in the forest as a means to talk about marginalization and their place in a social hierarchy without actively having to implicate themselves or their neighbors, right? Animals become a vehicle for difficult discussions. What happens to these difficult discussions, to these stories, to these other ways of valuing wildlife when they're no longer present? And I think it's easy for us to sort of argue why these valuations are important, but it's more complicated to demonstrate how that knowledge should be shaped and included in conservation practice. This brings us to the last sort of point of an important discussion on human communities. Like the photo we looked at of the Bai, human communities can be perceived also as one-dimensional. However, we all know from our own lived experiences that communities are flexible and fluid and that they change over time and space and vary by context. As a scientist, I think one of the most sort of emblematic or best examples of how we portray communities is in thinking about the one-dimensional aspects pertaining to planning and project funding. Requirements for most conservation projects include some type of statement on local communities. I myself, as a young researcher, quite often commented on how I would contribute to community capacity building. Right here on the page, as I wrote it, communities became unidimensional, right? They were only one dimension. The complex dynamics that shaped the communities were lost, and the community became reduced to homogeneous black box that did not reflect reality. The concept of community then in this work, in my own past experiences and my own current work, becomes reduced to something that often doesn't exist beyond a piece of paper, right? There's a lot of past work that you might be familiar with, the discussion of paper parks in African and South American contexts when you're thinking about protected areas. And here we're sort of talking about communities on paper, right? This cannot always be avoided because it's impossible to describe communities in their complexity on paper. However, the real issue comes when we think about the fact that community aspects of a lot of work don't develop beyond the proposal, and they often do not extend beyond the project because it's complicated and it's messy. Communities must be a constant part of our projects, before, during, and after. We have to remember that communities shift across space and time, and that our projects might have to and must shift with them. We have to look at individual and collective experience and consider that they're context dependent. A project that is made to specifically fit the needs of community today will likely not fit the needs of the community tomorrow, and the community might not even exist tomorrow. An example, in Zanga Sanga, following the coup d'etat, we saw immense changes in the community structure, right? Following political upheaval. And the Zanga Sanga Protected Areas Complex has historically, and there's a lot of literature you can look at to this, been an area of constant in-migration and out-migration, fluctuating with economies and political stability. The community is constantly a moving, shaping, living thing that we've had to work with and address. We have to allow space and conservation programming to accommodate for the ever-fluid nature of communities. When reimagining conservation and wildlife, and the context in which conservation is practiced, we have to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We have to open our minds to different perspectives across different contexts. And while I've used the Zanga Sanga Protected Areas Complex as my primary example, because that's where I have a lot of images from, and that's where I've spent a lot of my time and most recently come back from, we have to remember that this is true across ecological landscapes. Right? The way that we view and the way that we imagine wildlife and forest systems is something that we should be addressing in each location where we work. If we can shift our perspectives on how conservation is practiced, we'll take an important step in providing traction to narratives of sustainability and increasing the effectiveness of the science behind the work that we do. So how are we reimagining wildlife and approaches to conservation at Tingetta? Our holistic approach at Tingetta Wildlife is unique in that we assist countries in achieving their own sustainable solutions and not ours. We use rapid ethnographic assessment methods to assess and develop capacity programming that's rooted in what the community needs and compatible with multiple different perspectives. Rapid ethnographic assessment is particularly important in current conservation context, as it allows for rich qualitative and situational data to be generated in a shorter time frame. Oftentimes, a lot of conservation projects have been hesitant to engage in ethnographic methodologies and community work because it can often take a longer time frame. And the truth of the matter is that in conservation work, we don't always have the time that takes, or think that we have the time that it takes, or have the time on the funding cycle. So we've worked really hard at Tingetta and in my own work to develop new methods for achieving sort of these rich situational understandings of complex areas on a shorter time frame. And I'm happy to provide some examples of that after the talk. All anti-poaching and hunting interventions have to collaborate with communities to support socially responsible conservation, and this includes perspective. Right, anti-poaching and conservation programs will not be able to change behaviors of individuals, but we can understand and shift their perspectives on wildlife economies, but not before we shift our own as practitioners. It's only at this point when we can we address behavior by removing barriers that might restrict an individual's ability to meet the daily needs of themselves or their families. In the programs that we support, we've seen declines in poaching of large species such as elephants, shifting arrest patterns that are in line with judicial practices, and programming in line with international human rights law. And more importantly, we've also been able to empower communities by building our program from their perspectives. In Reimagining Wildlife, we're elevating the voices of the people and the wildlife living in the systems we seek to protect. Thank you very much. And hopefully that wasn't too long and we have some time for questions. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Just want to say in the first place to everybody, we had a cancellation for tonight, and Caroline came in on a short notice, being Thanksgiving, not having had too much champagne to drink yet. Really thank you for sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, of course.
I think this is the type of talk that I would like to listen to again, because it's filled with so much facts and information. I think a second time will do me well, but I am touched by the fact that there are so many multiple layers that we have to look at, and then also the whole point about the value, what is something worth and whose perspective. Also something that you mentioned tonight that it's so logic, but you don't think about it. The fact that communities are fluid, the fact that the same group that you dealt with 10 years ago is no longer the same group. So I think fascinating, intriguing, worth listening to again, and to the students. I think this is something that we as scientists should also focus on. Caroline, I would like Marette to unmute everybody. We give her a round of applause and then questions and answers. Marette, if you can. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well done, very good.
Chris, you are muted, so if you're talking, you're talking to yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rod, for reminding me the minute that Marette mute everybody, then I'm muted again. If Dave Pepler was on tonight, he would say an excellent lecture. But let's get the students to ask the questions. So any questions, just raise your hand, please, or just raise it electronically, or just wave your hand, and then we will get to the questions. Thank you very much. Robin Brown, I saw you just came in, or you are in, but I saw your photo, your face is on. All right. No questions so far.
Perfect.
Well, then
There'll be something.
Then Thanksgiving is going to happen.
Amy Young, surely.
Amy
Amy Young, surely you have a question you should have a question. Amy?
No, she just raised her hand. She's unmuted. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, I was being polite and I was letting other people go first. So I would love to hear, and maybe this would help generate some questions in other people's minds, a little bit of information and a little of those nuggets of knowledge that you have been able to learn from communities from these methods. So can you give us some?
Sure. One of my there's a lot of them, but one of my favorite examples comes from actually work that I've done in Korup National Park. So I started working there in 2014 in Southwest Central African Republic, Southwest Cameroon, sorry. A lot of Southwests. Korup National Park, many of you may be familiar with it, also a very famous original ICDP established in the late 80s, early 90s. I worked there with my former student, now colleague, Alexander Hoffner. And while I spent most of my life studying hunting in Central Africa and Cameroon, they see me as somebody who studies human health. So I worked quite diligently of setting up a relationship with a community in Cameroon for Ali to do her master's work. And quite quickly in her work, right, so she had a very short amount of time to conduct her ethnographic field work. So we had a really good chance to sort of field test some of these methods. And one very interesting thing that came out was the linguistic terms that researchers use to talk about hunting. In the case of Alexandra's work, she was asking questions quite commonly about, it's a very small village, are you a hunter? If you're a hunter, how are you hunting? Standard questions. And everyone kept saying, no, I'm not a hunter. And she's like, okay, well, I see you eating a diker, and, Carolyn's been working here for years, and we know that there's a lot of hunting in this region. And the issue came that people don't perceive themselves as hunters. First and foremost, they perceive themselves as farmers. So when you ask somebody what their occupation is, they tell you that they're a farmer. It's true. They are a farmer. They all have farms. They're also trapping and hunting off of their farms, but it's a secondary occupation and not one that they identify with as part of their position, right? If you're a hunter in that region, you own your own gun or you contract your gun out, right? Otherwise, you are by no means a hunter, right? If we think about that in context, that means that, decades of work that's come before focusing primarily on hunting likely hasn't been asking the right questions, right? For simply overlooking a linguistic approach. I have another student who's Cameroonian, right? Studying hunting in a different protected area of Cameroon. And to him, that wasn't something that came up because he already understood, right? He already knew the context and the categories of hunting. So when I asked him about that or was reading his work, I noticed already that hunter was not a category, right? And so it gave us a really good comparison, right, of two students at a similar level coming from a different perspective, one community member and one student who's trained in a different approach to scientific work. And so now, as a result of this work, right, we have a completely new understanding from Alexandra's work of how people engage primate hunting in that part of the world.
And you've probably revamped questionnaires.
Yes, right. So it's sort of why you, it's about training people how to ask questions in the right way, right? Which is oftentimes in art. Even in my own work, when I was a PhD student, I found when I was studying hunting practices, that the way people perceived game animals or any animal in the forest was not the same as the way I had been trained to view it, right? I viewed large charismatic species like big game hunting, right, in my mind included the apes, bongo, elephants, right? All of the things that I considered to be at that point, right? The ones you would see at a zoo or the ones that conservation would be framed around. And so I was quite surprised that most hunters didn't in my research didn't include gorillas as large game, right? So large game and protected status all have a very different context based on the environmental history of the person whom you're interviewing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And another point that really stood out to me from your presentation was how quickly the communities can change. And
absolutely.
How long it can take us to, collaborate with them and develop a project for them. And by the time you get into the meat of it, their needs may have changed. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's again, right, it's a simple problem or solution that's so easy to overlook. I always used to use an example with my own students, right? When you're working in a group project, right? Even managing the 4 members of your group, the needs of each student changes daily based on whether or not they have another paper due or something else, right? And that when you add in much more layers of complexity, you have to sort of expect that, anticipate that, and it's very difficult. And it makes the process really challenging, but being open to accepting that dimensionality often makes the process easier. Messier, but easier.
Yes. Always messy. Great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? There's Robin Brown. I'm unmuting you, Robin.
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed your talk. Some amazing information and experiences that came through there. Thank you very much indeed. My one is a bit of a practical question.
Sure.
A lot of the studies that take place in the area that I'm more used to, there's not so much vegetation around. Are there many elephant collared in the area, or other large species that have got collars, and people tracking these animals in the CAR?
Yeah, so that's outside of the scope of the work that I do at Changetta, but I know that, right, so APDS, the Zongasonga Protected Areas Complex, right, is WWF and the government, and I know that there are research projects with some elephants in the region. It's beyond the scope of anything I have information on for you, but I could, if Selena's still on, I'm sure she could point you to the individuals working on it, or we could connect you by email.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just wondering, obviously a lot of the collaring takes place. I mean, it used to be a lot of transmitters, and now it's more satellite with all that vegetation, how that would affect it. But also just interesting to understand how far those elephants move in the forest scenario in a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really right, some of the work that my colleague Melissa Remus and I have been doing on understanding elephant trails and the importance of elephant trails to conservation programming in the Congo Basin really hinges on our sort of understanding of distances of movement, right? And how if you want to think about landscapes differently, right, the actual presence of the trails themselves that the elephants are opening as they're moving are maintaining the forest for dikers, for pigs to move, for people to move, right? Hunters are using the same trails. So having that sort of understanding of how far they're going will be really rich if and when it's available.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks, Colin. Next person we want to unmute is Jeremy Anderson. Jeremy, over to you, please.
Caroline, firstly, I thought it was a really interesting talk. What I was particularly interested in was your statement, we need to look at reimagining the systems we seek to protect. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a bit on that. We're looking at savanna systems down here, but obviously you're looking at forests.
Right.
But how do you reimagining how they function, or?
So I think for me, reimagining is more pausing to consider the way I think about a system in the first place. So there's actually been a lot of interesting work in pastoral systems in savanna areas in the East that are very, as sort of an interesting example. So not sort of course, the way they actually function will likely not change, right? Their ecotrophic levels and, there are aspects of ecology and the bio and physical world that just are what they are, but it's how we approach them and understand them. And one example that has always been really interesting to me that I think is probably more applicable in savanna settings and then forested settings is a theory in ecology called disequilibrium theory, right? Generally in ecology, we think of things as being in balance, or that if something disturbs the system, it's constantly trying to balance itself out. And this group of ecologists said, what if you flip the narrative and think about the system as constantly maintaining itself at disequilibrium, because that's how it moves forward, right? That's how it stays dynamic. So rather than seeing a predator-prey relationship as restoring some sort of balance to the system, what if you focus on the noise that it creates in the other direction? And that's really just as a way to think about the landscape differently, to see if you're missing something. Right? Generally, when you add people into the equation, you're going to get a lot less of that equilibrium. So in that case, it makes sense, right? When you're looking at the way pastoralists in Eastern Africa sort of move through systems and protected areas, disequilibrium becomes more interesting. So it's more about, right, how the system itself works from a very physical level, pausing and thinking, right, how your own bias, how your own positionality as a researcher, how your own positionality as a person hailing from X, Y, and Z is shaping the way you imagine, the way you think you understand that system, right? And push yourself to think about it from the opposite perspective, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. It does. I mean, it's a bit like resilience. I mean, moving from one plane of resilience into another,
right,
and not being able to get back into it.
Right, or thinking that maybe you're right, the in resilience theory is not necessarily trying to get back to something. It's just constantly shifting, right, what it is in general.
Into another level.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks, Caroline. Any other questions?
Well, question. Is Marty Jasper sleeping tonight? What's his problem?
No, Marty said that he's got to pay his attention on two sides tonight. I see he's in. Yeah, I think this is really very interesting. And as I said, I need to internalize what you've said. Really sort of think back in my own, my own career and say, okay, this is, internalize it and take the truth out of that. Also, knowing that what counts depends on the view. I see Janssen Davies got another question there. Janssen, I'm asking you to unmute.
Hi, Caroline. I think a wonderful talk, wonderfully stimulating and fresh, I think, for many conservationists, particularly in Africa. But here's a question. The proposition that you put to us, that think of a different perspective, is, of course, by definition, just another different perspective, right?
Yeah. Yes, it is a different perspective. I think it depends on which level of perspective you're thinking of. So I often, when we're talking about, right, in the work that we do with Chingetta, thinking about, illegal wildlife trades, that, I coming in and sort of suggesting I can change people's behavior isn't going to work, right? If someone shows up to my house today and says there's no turkeys for Thanksgiving, I'm just going to shut the door in their face and move on, right? But I can talk to them. I can think about how I can shift their perspective, right? And so one way we've done this in our research group is thinking about who is conservation for, right? That's the question that people ask a lot. In a lot of my past ethnographic work, participants would say that conservation is for, essentially the term is outsiders, right? Conservation is for others or for people outside of my community. And so one thing I thought a lot about was how could I shift that perspective? I'm not a conservation organization. I'm just a person that, right, it's just that point, just a student running around asking people, you know, if they've seen a diker in the last week. Right, but how could I shift that perspective? So one thing our research group did with the health work is that if we can demonstrate a way that ecological integrity and forest integrity matters to your very own body, right, using point of care health assessments, can we change your perspective to see how conservation can be for you? Right, that it's hard to say, right, the funds from ecotourism come back to a community. Of course, in many cases they do, but that's not right. Money is not something that people can see. It's not something they can live and experience every day. But demonstrating how forest health and forest integrity affects your actual skin and the skin of your children, right? In Cameroon, they always talk about your health is your skin. Um, Allows us to shift the perspective. We're not changing the way people think or understand wildlife, but we've helped them to find a different way to reconnect to conservation, right? To see it as a being for them, because it is, it's just not been presented that way. So of course it is, of course, just asking someone to change to a whole new perspective, but really I would think it's more about incorporating multiple perspectives into one lens. It's sort of, I've written some papers about it elsewhere that get much more diffuse and thinking about it as diffraction, right? That when light diffracts through something, it takes on a multitude of new things, right? And that's really what you're talking about with perspective. But yes, I do take your point. It's something you have to really think about when you're using the terms with change or just perspective. But it's more sort of making it greater than the sum of the parts.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Janssen. Janssen reminded me that when Plato got to the end of eternity, he asked the question, what's on the other side? So that's a typical Janssen Davies question. Thank you, Janssen. All right, I see Amy wants to ask another question.
Yes, thank you. Okay. I'll just mention briefly for those that weren't watching Rory's presentation about Chengeta, which was, I knew about Chengeta, but I learned a lot more detail during Rory's presentation. And I've been out of school for a bit, so I did not know about Dr. Robinson. And so when Rory presented the two cases, it was Mali and Zanga. Of the two projects, one was working and one wasn't. And the one that was working is because they were working with the community. And the one that wasn't working, they had not yet started, or they did not originate the project working with the community. So my question to Dr. Robinson was, holy crap, please tell me this is published, because unfortunately we need so much of this in peer review in order to convince people.
Yeah.
Which is what Dr. Robinson was referring to earlier, and for so many different reasons that are frustrating, like funding. And so the nerve that touched with me is your comment that a hunter's or a community member's perspective is still not considered as data.
Mm-hmm.
And so since science and conservation can sometimes be very slow to change, and we need it to change quickly for them to understand how communities and people are important. Is that changing? Like the reviewer that made the comment that that observation is not data, are more people waking up to it, or are they resistant?
It is. It's changing slowly, right? I will say that in even like in the 10 years that I've been publishing, editors of a lot of the bigger journals are really trying to get their boards to shift their perspective, right? Okay. And so, and one way for anybody that's on the call that publishes that we've achieved this sort of as a group of like-minded academics is to publish special issues. In many cases, the editors have demonstrated to the reviewers that, for example, oftentimes they want the format of introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion, right? That they're supporting the publication of papers that don't follow that scientific method narrative. And so a lot of people I know have been doing that by coming together with special issues that have a different format. So it's sort of like forcibly getting people to read something new.
Okay.
And it's hard because it requires the changing the very fundamental underpinnings of the way we've done science, right? As a primatology student, the famous example, right, is Jane Goodall's first publications when she was trying to refer to David Greybeard and Frodo and Fifi with personal pronouns and giving them very humanistic terms, right? And that's still something we're working to. I do think it's getting better, but it's taking time, and it's frustrating. And I'm hoping we're in a moment where, in many cases, when we're looking in parks where we're literally looking for a single sighting of one species, just to say, is it even there, right? How is it possible that a person whose only job in this world is to go out and hunt that species is not enough?
Yeah.
And so it comes with time, and I hope we're getting there. I've seen a change in my own ability to publish. Yeah.
Okay.
Caroline, I want to remind you that you owe me a publication on Serpithecus, Ellen's swamp monkey.
Yes.
That refers to exactly this. So.
Yes. So.
We're waiting for that. Yeah.
There was an example. One day I'll actually get it together. I just finished publishing something from 5 years ago, Rod, so it's in the queue.
Exactly, it's slow.
But during my PhD work, there was a particular monkey that came up all the time. And I would ask, what is this monkey? What is this monkey? And nobody could tell me. I couldn't find a picture in a book because it was just, before Rod was there weren't really any tourists. It was just me running around with like the only field guide I had that had like 2 monkeys in it. And, I finally gave up on it, and I had, I think, 75 documentations of it in my data. I mentioned it in the publication as a side note because I wasn't allowed to talk about it fully. Flash forward several years, I'm drinking a cup of coffee at 4 a.m. and Rod post a camera trap video from Sangha Lodge, and it's this monkey, right, that we thought that was always there. But it was a type of data that people recognized, right, a camera trap. And so it's sort of thinking about what is a sighting is the way I think of it, like what accounts as a sighting of an animal. It's coming, Rod. It's been drafted. It's just languishing with this with the remaining swamp monkeys.
All right. While we now on to Rod's PhD.
Yes.
Sorry, Chris. Tessa just wants to say something in that line.
Yeah, just to jump in, I was just in contact with a researcher. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi.
Great talk. And we were chatting about pangolins, and they said, yeah, we've had this species, and apparently there's this species that local hunters have seen, but I haven't been able to prove it scientifically.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. So you see even that in this sort of, it's still very, and it's, a young researcher, so we still have work to do in terms of even that language. Maybe the intention wasn't that, but it's still very much, proving something. It's only evidence. It's only real if it can be documented by that, the data set that you've mentioned. So
right. And I think, pangolins are certainly a species where we could push that language harder, because we need all the sightings that we can get of different species in different locations. So it could be, and it comes up when people are starting to do action plans and like regional surveys of sort of what's the state of a species. And I think it'll take sort of shifting it in those moments, or of all of us coming together and publishing these sightings, and just saying them for what they are, sightings of the species we're looking for.